The ability to instantly share any song from the history of recorded music is actually a pretty recent invention. It wasn't so long ago that if you wanted to share music, you did it with physical objects called cassettes. We called these mixtapes, and you are not going to believe how difficult it was to make one. The first thing you needed was a blank tape. A package of blank tapes was like a box of potential. And once you had the tape, you didn't fill it with music by dragging and dropping while you checked Facebook in the other window. The songs had to be painstakingly recorded one by one in real time. Some people would even listen to the radio all day, waiting for their song to come on just so they could capture it on a mixtape. Think about that the next time you're complaining that the obscure band you like isn't streaming on Spotify. It was such a labor of love with so many challenges. Tapes were tangible objects that came with hard time limits. If you didn't plan, you might run out of tape in the middle of a song. And then you had to do that whole side over again. Making a mixtape was a process, but it was also an opportunity to think about the person you were making the tape for. From the songs you chose to the order you put them in, every aspect of making a mixtape was an opportunity to say something. It could almost feel like actually producing an album. You would imagine them listening to the music, hoping they'd appreciate every choice you made. But the truth is, they didn't need to. Making a mixtape was frankly such a pain in the ass that the mere act of simply doing it was enough to send a message. Every mixtape was an irreplaceable, one-of-a-kind, special in its own way, which made it all the more heartbreaking when things went wrong, though they could usually be fixed with the help of some other advanced 80s technology. You know, obviously we have developed more efficient, simpler ways to share songs you like, but unless you are actually a musician, there is still no better way to say something with music.
But we're in the middle of our Psalmify series. If you haven't been here or haven't listened to this, what we're doing is every week we are exploring one of the Psalms. A different speaker every week is sharing a Psalm that means something to them. And I thought we'll do that again today. I have a Psalm for you, but I thought we'd also do something a little different, which is what the video is kind of setting us up for. I thought what we could try to do this morning is just to develop our appreciation for the Psalms and what they are. Because I think for a lot of us, reading the Psalms in the Bible is a little bit like discovering a mixtape from the 80s, right? There's this thing, a lot of time and effort went into assembling it, this book of Psalms and songs and poetry and prayers. There's something really meaningful being expressed by this whole collection, and something's being communicated through it to us, but it can be a little lost on us. We don't really appreciate what we have here. It's like looking at a cassette tape when you've grown up in the Spotify generation. You don't really know what it is or what to do with it. You don't understand maybe what it's trying to say or appreciate all the effort that went into creating it and compiling it and what all that means. And for some of us, I think it goes even further than that. So I'm going to share the little unspoken truth maybe that's underlying this series is that some of you don't even really like the Psalms that much. It's okay. I'm not going to judge, but I know, I get it. I've heard this from people before, right? It's different. It's not like the historical books of the Old Testament or the Gospels where you get this story, this narrative. The Psalms don't always have a real clear practical teaching point or application like you get in some of the letters from Paul or Peter or John in the New Testament. There's all this poetic language that can be kind of difficult to understand. It can be confusing, maybe a little flowery and antiquated. They're like an old analog cassette when we would rather listen to the latest playlist, right? So if you're not a fan of the Psalms, that's okay. That's what I want to try to work through this morning a little bit and hope we can develop a little bit of a better appreciation for them. And for me, the appreciation of the Psalms comes from not so much knowing how to read them, like what they say, what they mean, as it is how to use them. And the answer to that is we use them in prayer. That's where I found the best application for the Psalms. We all know we need to pray, but I think a lot of us would probably agree that we're not very successful often in the discipline of prayer. Tim Keller wrote a book on this topic called Simply Prayer, and in the opening, he writes that he was teaching a Bible study course on the Psalms, and that's when he realized that he was barely scratching the surface of what the Bible commanded and promised regarding prayer. So then later he said him and his wife were going through a difficult phase of life. They had some health issues, and his wife felt really convicted that they need to pray the Psalms, or pray together every single night. They ended up using the Psalms, but she puts it like this. She says, "Imagine you were diagnosed with such a lethal condition that the doctor told you that you would die within hours unless you took a particular medicine, a pill every night before going to sleep. Imagine that you were told you could never miss it or you would die. Would you forget? Would you not get around to it some nights? No, it would be so crucial that you wouldn't forget, you would never miss. Well, if we don't pray together to God, we're not going to make it because of all we're facing. This is what she's saying to her husband, Tim Keller. I'm certainly not. We have to pray. We can't just let it slip our minds. And so for me, this is where the Psalms come in. They can help when we're failing to pray for whatever reason that may be, whether you don't have the energy, whether you don't have the motivation or maybe the clarity or the words to pray. The Psalms, they can act like that mixtape. It's this vehicle to express to God the things that we have a hard time putting into words and saying ourselves. And so this morning, I want to share kind of 4 common challenges to prayer and the ways that I think the Psalms can help. And I'm going to use Psalm 16 to work through this and illustrate it. So let's start here. When you're not feeling it, start with a Psalm warm-up. Probably the biggest barrier to prayer, I think, is quite simply we're just not into it. We're just not feeling it. We're distracted. We're tired. We feel distant from God. Maybe you're in a bad mood. Maybe, to be honest, we're just plain lazy. But when we're not in the mood, a psalm can help warm up our hearts to meet with God. For me, there's 2 things that I think most affect my mood and my ability to pray, and those things are stress and fatigue. When I'm stressed, I'm just too anxious, or I'm just simply too busy, too beat up, too unmotivated to pray. And then on the other end of that, I get tired, right? And fatigue makes me just feel too exhausted, too beat up, too unmotivated to pray. And so in those situations, a psalm can really help shift my perspective away from my worries, or if I'm, just feeling that exhaustion, it can help me focus my tired mind and my heart on God. So if you know that you need to be praying, but you just find yourself, you're not in the mood, I'm going to suggest a great time to open up the Psalms is that moment. That's when to use these. But before you do, I want to offer one little extra piece of advice to further help you focus and help you kind of settle your mind and your heart. And it's something that you see many people do, in particular, Steve Jobs and Jesus. Did you know they had something in common? Now, I don't want to make too many comparisons here. Okay, but Steve Jobs, co-founder of Apple, he was known before he had a big meeting, a big presentation, before he was making important decisions. What he would go out and do is he'd take a long walk all by himself. And these walks, he'd use them to clear his mind, to focus and to think different. Only a couple people got that. It's good. I kind of thought that. And we know in the Gospels that Jesus often withdrew from the crowds to find a quiet place. He had a very busy ministry. People were coming to him, but he often went away alone to a quiet place to pray. And beyond that, he instructs us to do the exact same thing. He said, when you pray, go into your room and shut the door and pray to your Father who is in secret. Right? That was his advice. So if you don't feel up to praying, the first step is to find yourself some solitude, a place where you can just get away from all your stuff, all that stuff that's going on, and just be alone with God. Whether it's, outdoors on a walk like Steve Jobs, or it's alone in a bedroom like Jesus said you to do. And at that point, I think that's a great point to open up and read through a psalm. So I'm going to do that right now. I'm going to read through Psalm 16 with you. It's a psalm written by David. So let's go. I'll put it on the screen here. Preserve me, O God, for in you I take refuge. I say to the Lord, you are my Lord. I have no good apart from you. As for the saints in the land, they are the excellent ones, in whom is all my delight. The sorrows of those who run after another God shall multiply. Their drink offerings of blood I will not pour out or take their names on my lips. The Lord is my chosen portion and my cup. You hold my lot. The lines have fallen for me in pleasant places. Indeed, I have a beautiful inheritance. I bless the Lord who gives me counsel. In the night, also my heart instructs me. I have set the Lord always before me because he is at my right hand. I shall not be shaken. Therefore, my heart is glad and my whole being rejoices. My flesh also dwells secure. For you will not abandon my soul to Sheol, or let your Holy One see corruption. You make known to me the path of life. In your presence there is fullness of joy. At your right hand are pleasures forevermore. So for me, and what negatively affects my mood and my focus, I find in Psalm 16 here, there's just so much good stuff that soothes and comforts and inspires and encourages me. It kind of stokes my fire. And I think it fits with, the worship set we did earlier. It's just so uplifting. Now, that being said, I want to just issue a quick caveat. If you sit down and you just open up the Psalms at random, you might not necessarily find a psalm like Psalm 16 to lift you up out of a bad mood. There are a lot of psalms that express some very, very difficult emotions. You'll find anger and disappointment and fear and complaint and even feelings of being abandoned by God in there. But I think those are helpful too. In those psalms, the writers actually teach us how to voice our most difficult thoughts and feelings to God and how to process those in relationship with him. And so Darcy McCallum actually delivered 2 great messages on those very kinds of psalms earlier in our series. So if you missed those, go back and check those out. I encourage you to check them out on YouTube or our website. But back to Psalm 16, if you didn't find it as uplifting as I do, and if it hasn't kind of won you over yet with a new appreciations for the Psalms, that's okay. I hope I can help you get there as we pull this apart a little more. So let's just kind of stick together and we'll work a little further through this as we talk about using Psalms in prayer. So the next point I want to make is when you don't know what to pray about, you can use the Psalms as prayer prompts. You know, sometimes you can carve out a little prayer time. Maybe you've found a little quiet place alone. You've managed to muster up that determination and that discipline to pray. And so you close your eyes or maybe even look up and you say, Lord, and then you realize you just don't know what to pray about. And so in those moments, we need a little nudge or a little prompt. Did you know that prompt was one of the finalists for the 2023 Oxford Word of the Year? You know why? Of course, it's the growing popularity of AI like ChatGPT. You enter a prompt, right? In that context, a prompt is an instruction you give to the AI program or algorithm that then determines or influences the content that it's going to generate for you. So it's a new use for an old word. The word itself, if you go back to the origins in Latin and Old English, it actually means being brought to light or being prepared and ready. So sometimes I find that reading a psalm before I pray not only warms up my heart to pray, but it also prompts me. It prompts my NI, my natural intelligence, right, to generate the content I'm going to pray about. Or to use the original meaning of the word, it brings something to light. The Psalms bring things to light for me, and they make me prepared. They make me ready. So let's try this out. I've got time, right? I've got the will, but my mind is kind of blank. So then I open up Psalm 16 to see what can I pray about. I'm feeling drained. I got a lot of things on my mind. And here's what I found as I kind of worked through it. Just a few things that jumped out at me. So verses 1 and 2, you see dependence on God, right? He says, preserve me, O God. David is making a plea out of deep trust in God. He trusts him to keep him safe. And it's rooted in God's promise to keep and guard the covenant community of Israel, who look to him as their home or refuge, right? These people who are gathered towards God. Then in verse 3, he makes an appeal to community. David recognizes the importance of the community of saints, meaning Israel, the godly people who make up God's family here on earth. So he speaks to that. The next theme I see in verses 4 and 5 are devotion. You really get a sense of how devoted David is to God, right? He denounces people who chase after other gods and who make sacrifices. That's that reference to drink offerings and blood. These people are making sacrifices to false gods. David says, I'm not going to do that. Instead, he affirms that he has chosen the God of Israel. And he says that God holds his lot. Right? This is referring to the casting of lots as a way of making decisions. And so he's saying basically he trusts his fate to God. He trusts that and puts that into God's hands. Continuing on, verse 6, you see a lot of gratitude. There are these lines that have fallen for me in pleasant places, he says. These are boundary lines marking a property. And he's talking about inheritance. That's the inheritance of the land that God had promised Israel. So David is giving thanks for the promised land that God has blessed Israel with and all the provisions he's given them. Then verses 7 and 8, we start to see evidence of confidence and hope in David. You know, he clearly trusts God's ways. He commits himself to God's instruction. He says, the Lord gives me counsel. And then that influences his heart that also instructs him. But then he also recognizes that he can't do it alone, that he needs God, he says, to go before me, to go ahead of him. But then he knows that when that happens, that he will not be shaken, right? There's just incredible confidence in what God can do if he just follows his instruction. Next, if we go to the next couple of verses 9 and 10, I get a sense of peace in David's heart. And then he gives praise out of that. He says he has a glad heart and his whole being rejoices. He sounds completely at peace because he says, my flesh also dwells secure. There's this physical feeling of being completely safe and at peace. So he seems to trust God that we will stay with him and see him through to good ends. He believes God's never going to abandon him. And then he continues those thoughts into the final verses, and you just get a sense of David praising God for his goodness, the goodness of God, right? He says, you make known to me the path of life. In your presence, there's fullness of joy. He sees God as this ultimate source of goodness and pleasure for eternity. So now, having kind of pulled those things out, I can take any or all of those things and I can think about them and how they maybe apply to my own life and my own relationship with God. And some of those things I'm going to pray in agreement with them. I'm going to say, I'm going to echo what David said. I feel that, right? Like my gratitude for what God has provided or the ways that I depend on God. But in other areas, I have to confess how I fail, how maybe I lack confidence in God's plan. I don't have the kind of confidence David had, or how I've chased after other gods in my life, not literal gods, but other things that pull me away, right? And so often I find this exercise of finding prayer prompts in the Psalms leads me to pray about things that I normally wouldn't have thought about, or that I often neglect because I'm too busy praying about my own worries, my own needs, my own fears, and I don't recognize other things like just praising God for how good he is. So these prompts help me shift my perspective to the bigger picture, to some of these topics we just looked at. Praising God for who he is, thanking him for his community of saints, for this group of people that we are a part of, the church. And we don't have to just stop there. I think there's one more step we can take down this train of thought. When you read the Psalms, don't just look for prompts and themes. You can also look for Jesus in there. And if you look for him, you might find him more often than you would expect in this Old Testament book. It's interesting. So let me show you an example here in Psalm 16 where we can find Jesus. So if you were to go to the book of Acts, in the second chapter, you would see Peter is preaching his very first sermon. And in that, he says that David was a prophet who foresaw and spoke about the resurrection of Christ. And then, it's interesting, what proof does he give of that? He quotes Psalm 16, saying that Jesus was not abandoned to Hades, which is the Greek term for Sheol that we just read in Psalm 16. And he says, nor did his flesh see corruption. So the same words David spoke. We can go a little further too. When we go back to Psalm 16 now and we read David talking about this beautiful inheritance in Psalm 16, we know that through Jesus' sacrifice on the cross, we also have an inheritance. The people of Israel at that time had this inherited land, but we have something much bigger. Jesus speaks of our inheritance as eternal life in his kingdom. He said that when he returns, he will call his sheep and he will say, come, you who are blessed by my Father. Inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. So if you take the time to really dig into the Psalms, maybe get yourself a good devotional or a good prayer book, you'll find all kinds of references to Jesus throughout, and it's really cool. It's like, seeking out little Easter eggs. Okay, so let's move on. You've made the time to pray. No more excuses. You've done away with that. You found a quiet place, maybe. You know what you want to pray about now. But now what do you say? What do you say to this immense but invisible God of the universe? Sometimes I just find I just don't know how to express my thoughts, feelings, needs. I just can't seem to put them into now actual words. So when you're lost for words, let the Psalms speak for you. Did you know that there's a lot of singers and bands that actually use teleprompters during their concerts to remember the lyrics? And I'm talking big acts like Bruce Springsteen, U2, Adele. They use teleprompters. In fact, there was a concert, Adele, she was about to perform her hit song, Rolling in the Deep, and the teleprompter conked out. Weird, eh? We would know nothing about technical issues during a performance. Anyway, she got flustered, and she kind of laughed it off and joked with the audience, I forgot the words to my own song, and everybody kind of laughed back. But then she seemed to be struggling, and it seemed like she wasn't going to get through the song. But that's when her backup singers stepped in, and they began singing the next lines, prompting her to pick up where she left off. And so with her help, she got back on track, everything went smoothly, and they finished the song without missing another beat. Now you might hear that story and think, shouldn't a singer of that caliber know the lyrics to their own songs? Well, I could say, shouldn't followers of Jesus know the words that they want to pray, right? We all just need a little help sometimes, a little help getting to the words. And I think the Psalms can serve almost like those backup singers. And beyond that, I think they can also give us some really great vocabulary and language to give shape to our prayers. So let me show you what I mean. I've kind of picked out a few words, phrases that I found personally interesting in Psalm 16. So right from the very beginning, preserve me, O God. I just love this because I could and should probably pray this simple request every day, and I often do. It's so short, but so necessary to ask God for his care and his protection, to keep us safe, to recognize that we need him to sustain us through everything in life, and all just summed up in 4 simple words. It doesn't have to be a lengthy prayer, right? Oh, preserve me, O God. The next thing I thought was interesting is David says, the Lord is my chosen portion. I don't know about you, but I often pray more along the lines of, I would like God to choose me. I would like God to love me, to guide me, to show himself to me. But in this line, David professes that he chooses God. He says, of all the things I could want or need, I choose God as my portion. So it's another word again for inheritance, or this idea of a gift or something received. So he's saying the most valuable thing I could hope to receive, I choose it to be God. Another interesting piece here, he refers to himself, speaking to God, he says, your Holy One. So he's calling himself God's Holy One. And you'll see this sometimes in David's Psalms particularly, and I find it a little surprising when he's that bold. Now, I understand he is the king that God appointed over Israel, but still seems a little cocky to go around calling yourself the Holy One, right? Or sometimes you see him say things like, I have been blameless. And I'm like, really? Blameless? Whew. And yet, while we might not be, king of Israel like David, I think there's something here, right? We are called to be God's holy ones, holy meaning set apart. God has called us to be set apart for his special purposes. And in a sense, we are blameless. We are made blameless through the sacrifice of Jesus. God looks at us as blameless as he would his own son. And Peter even says that we, the church, are a royal priesthood. So maybe we need to own that identity a little bit more and pray more boldly like David. Pray that we would live up to that identity that we've been given. And then one last one I really love at the very end. He says, in your presence, there is fullness of joy. David saying this to God. And I feel like this is just such an amazing statement to try to aspire to in the experience of prayer. I would love to be able to say something like this to God and to really, really mean that. I want to experience this deep awareness of God's presence like David does, and to encounter him in a relationship in such a real way that it's not just feel good, it's joy. It's the fullness of joy, like the most complete experience of joy. So those are a few examples of how the language of Psalm can kind of give words to our own prayer. And I know you might respond to different words than I do. We might see different things that really resonate with us, but I hope that kind of helps. But I do want to share one other way that I've used the Psalms to kind of help put prayer into words, or at least into breath. I've shared before, actually a few, kind of last time I spoke and previously, that I've had some issues dealing with worry and anxiety and that kind of thing. And one technique that I found recently that's really helped me are breath prayers, okay? So I read this book by Louis Giglio. It's called Putting an X Through Anxiety, and he shares this cool little factoid. He says that reigniting your breathing has a calming effect. The American Institute of Stress, yes, there is one of those, echoes this view. They say that deep breathing increases the supply of oxygen to your brain and stimulates the parasympathetic nervous system, which promotes a state of calmness. Breathing techniques help you feel connected to your body. It brings your awareness away from the worries in your head and quiets your mind. And then Louis Giglio follows that up by pointing out, isn't it amazing that God has hardwired into our anatomy a physical action that counters stress and helps alleviate the noise in our minds? He knew we would be prone to struggle with the giant of anxiety, so he equipped every one of us with a way to easily bring calm to chaos. It's very cool. So a breath prayer makes use of this phenomenon in a really cool way. So all you need to do is you pick a simple kind of 2-part verse that speaks to you, and you recite the first part as you breathe in, and the second part as you breathe out, and just repeat. So working with Psalm 16, you might choose something like that last verse again, the one we just talked about. You make known to me the path of life, deep breath in In your presence, there's fullness of joy. Deep breath out. Just an amazing way to make use of that breathing and to really contemplate the words and to pray. And it might sound weird to some of you, but I encourage you to give it a try. I find it actually is very calming. And I've also used it in the Dwell app. They have little breath prayers where you can actually listen to it and they'll kind of guide you through that and kind of set the pace. It's very cool. Now, in spite of all these kind of tips and techniques, I find there are still times when prayer just doesn't feel that genuine. It still kind of feels sometimes like we're just going through the motions. So the last piece I'm going to share with you here is when prayer seems empty, the Psalms actually model true relationship. So beyond warming up our hearts, beyond giving us some direction and some words, sometimes the Psalms can actually offer us something else. Sometimes it's not so much the words, but the writers and their posture towards God that teach us how to pray. Through them, I think we can learn what it means to live in a relationship with God and with Jesus. And I think Psalm 16 is a good example. You may have noticed that all throughout are references to being in God's presence. David says, "In you I take refuge." He says, "I bless the Lord who gives me counsel." Like, what does even that mean? I bless the Lord. Doesn't God bless us? How could we possibly bless God? But when you see that phrase in the Bible, blessing God, it means to respond to him. It means to give him praise and to recognize him for who he is. The Hebrew word for bless actually has the same root word as the Hebrew word to kneel. So it's that posture of praise. And then David follows up that by saying God gives him counsel. He blesses God and God gives him counsel. So that tells me that at some point in his prayer life, David is not the one doing the talking. At some point, he stops to listen, and God is doing the talking. And then again, that verse I brought up a few times, in your presence, there's fullness and joy. So it's fullness of joy, I should say. So there's all this kind of talk of being connected and present and with God. I think David's spirit in these verses teaches us a very often overlooked aspect to prayer, and that is to simply be in God's presence and to listen. And that is what some people will call contemplative prayer, to contemplate. You know, John Mark Comer, I shared a little bit last time I spoke about his book, Practicing the Way, and he had a great chapter that I just read a little while ago about this. He describes contemplative prayer like this. He says, contemplative prayer isn't looking to get anything from God. It's just looking at God. I look at him, he looks at me, and we are happy. Few of us even realize this type of prayer is a possibility. It's this deep layer of prayer that I find both most challenging and most rewarding. Challenging not because it's unpleasant, the opposite, in fact, but because it requires the very capacity of which our world schemes to rob me, attention. It's not that words in prayer are bad, they aren't. It's that you reach a point in any relationship, but especially with God, where words and even thoughts no longer carry you forward towards intimacy. They bring you so far, but not all the way. They may even hold you back. And so, reading Psalm 16, I think this is where David has arrived. He reached that point in the relationship where words aren't enough. Yes, he's writing words that we are reading, but these words seem to tell us and to show us that he has this intimacy that allows him to simply enjoy God's presence. So I think that's the final thought I want to kind of share and leave you guys with as the band comes up, is that, you know, it's funny that I came into this message intending to explore this idea of using the Psalms as this practical guide to prayer. I thought that would be cool if we could kind of dig some practical things out. But instead, this is one of the most interesting and profound things that I think I learned along the way. I started reading and thinking with this goal to explore how the Psalms could give words and expressions to our prayers to help us to say what we need to say to God, like the same way we used to use mixtapes of other people's songs to express what's on our hearts to somebody else. And then I went looking for a psalm that would exemplify that, and I landed on Psalm 16. But then as I read it and considered it, this was the biggest thing that kind of struck me. It's exactly what John Mark Comer was writing about. That some of the best, most intimate prayers don't really require words at all. Prayer is just such a strange thing, right? It's like so simple, and yet it's so difficult. Did God intend it to be that way? Is he trying to teach us something through that struggle? Maybe he wanted prayer to be a lifelong pursuit, something that we never perfected, so we would always be working on it. I don't know. But I do know that he compiled a pretty awesome soundtrack to it in the book of Psalms that would help us with that struggle. We just need to take the time to press play, so to speak, and appreciate it. And so with that, let's just take a moment to pray, and then we'll ask you guys to stand and join us in one final song. Preserve us, O God. We just look to you and trust you for everything. We pray that you would keep us safe, protect us, and that in all of our struggles, all of our worries, and all of our desires, all the things we want and need, we choose you. We make that same choice as David. We choose you. And even though we fail, God, you are the portion, you are the inheritance that we look to. You are our hope for the future. You are our confidence, and we get all of that through Jesus. God, thank you for all that you provide, but thank you most of all for your son, Jesus, who sets us apart as your holy ones, who sets us apart as a royal priesthood, who has brought together this community, a community of saints, a community of people who are committed to you. God, I pray that you would help each of us to experience you in new ways, experience you in relationship and in prayer, to experience you in such a way that we would know that same fullness of joy that David spoke about. So God, today, this morning, we just want to lift up our hearts to you and praise you simply for who you are, for being a good God who loves us enough to send his son Jesus to die for us. God, we thank you and we praise you in Jesus' name. Amen.
Join us every Sunday at 10 a.m. at Cineplex Cinemas in Milton, or visit us online at renewchurch.ca/connect.